All right, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 5 of the Rathus Introductory Psychology text. We're going to be diving into the subject of learning, sort of a meta task that we'll be engaging in. We'll be learning about learning. We'll be using our brain to learn a little bit about how the brain learns. Kind of strange when you say it out loud, but nonetheless, this is one of the more interesting chapters, I think, in the entire book because it's applicable to all of us. I mean, if you're reading this chapter, in psychology, you're trying to learn a little bit about psychology, so it's totally applicable to you. So anyways, let's jump in. Here are the learning outcomes, only a single page this time. You should, by the end of this chapter, have a pretty good idea of how to define learning. We're going to specifically focus on some theories about learning. We'll focus on classical conditioning, operant conditioning, also some other cognitive factors that are involved in learning, including sociocognitive theory about learning. So sort of three broad theoretical perspectives will be covered, and then some other related items to learning. So let's keep moving forward. Here's a review from chapter 4, to make sure you remember a little bit from chapter 4. Go ahead and pause the video in just a moment and write a few things that you can. Write some things down or provide some examples about insomnia, sleep apnea, narcolepsy, and nightmares versus night terrors. Okay, go ahead and pause the video. Okay, welcome back. Insomnia, you should have written something about how it's one of the more common disorders. It's the inability, to either fall asleep or stay asleep once you have fallen asleep. Sleep apnea is falling asleep at sleep apnea. I started talking about narcolepsy. Sleep apnea is when you wake up in the middle of the night. You stop breathing during sleep, and this can happen many, many times, or it can happen not many times, but it depends. It's commonly associated with obesity and being overweight. Not always the case, but that does seem to exacerbate it. Narcolepsy, again, it's falling asleep at inappropriate times, falling asleep without kind of sometimes warning. It's not as extreme in important times, maybe. And then we talk about nightmares versus night terrors. Nightmares are just bad dreams. They could be stress dreams, but a night terror is almost like having kind of like a panic attack during your sleep, and it could be related to a nightmare, but in some cases there may be no discernible cause. And night terrors are often more times associated with children. Nightmares, you can be an adult and have a bad dream, something you kind of grow out of. So truth or fiction questions. Pause the video, check, write down what you think, if it's true or false, and then we'll check your comprehension as we go forward. Okay, so what is learning? Well, there's a couple of different learning. So we have a behaviorist and we have a cognitive perspective, and both of these are, again, looking at the same phenomena, which is learning, and trying to explain it from a different perspective. The behaviorist view is that learning is a relative change or permanent change in your behavior over the course of time, of practice, and enough experience. And then response, but no focus on behavior, obviously, is that it's a change in the way you represent the environment due to experience. So they both put a lot of emphasis on practice and experience. But one is it's a way that you see things differently, and another is how you behave differently. And obviously there's a lot of overlap between those two, but they are kind of saying two different things while also saying the same thing, which is kind of strange to say. But that's where we're at. So we're really talking about relative changes to either your behavior or the way you think, or oftentimes both. When you learn something new, oftentimes it results in not only the way you think being changed, but also the way that you behave. So the biggest theory that we're going to look at first for this first video is classical conditioning. And you've probably heard a little bit about classical conditioning. If you've ever heard about Pavlov ringing the bell and getting his dogs to salivate, and eventually Pavlov gets his dogs to salivate just by ringing the bell. You've probably heard that before, maybe in pop culture or somewhere else. So let's let's dive into that. And so we're talking about a learning where a neutral stimulus evokes a response. The neutral stimulus at first evokes no response, but over time, with enough repeated pairings, the stimulus will start to evoke a response. And so we're talking about the learning of reflexive behavior. Sometimes these are unlearned responses, like in Pavlov's case with the dog. Dogs salivate when you put food in front of their mouths. They start to water. That's the beginning of the digestive process. This is not something that is taught. So, we're talking about behaviors that are oftentimes unlearned when we're talking about classical conditioning. We're talking about reflexive behaviors that can be learned through conditioning, through association. Anytime you see this word conditioning here, you can replace it with learning. That's kind of what we're talking about, is learning theory, is how organisms learn. And this theory about classical conditioning dates back to the beginning of the 20th century. Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist practicing in the former, I believe it was Russia at the time, not the USSR. He was practicing in Russia, and he was interested in explaining digestion in dogs, and that's the whole reason why he came up with this experiment. He wasn't a psychologist. Pavlov was not. He was a physiologist. He was a doctor. And so, he had this meat powder that he placed on the dog's tongue, and obviously that results in salivation. And he conditioned the dogs to salivate at the sound of a tone. He didn't actually use a bell. That is not actually true. Pavlov actually used a tuning fork or a tone because of the way the sound was going to be unambiguous. Maybe a bell could kind of sound like something else, I suppose. There's a little more ambiguity to the sound of a bell, but a tuning fork, that sound is very, very distinct. So in this case, the neutral stimulus is the sound produced by the tuning fork. And Pavlov conditioned the dogs to eventually salivate when they heard the tuning fork alone. And so the stimulus in this case was the food. The target response was salivation, which eventually became a conditioned response. At first, it was an unconditioned response. The dogs did not have to be taught how to salivate. You put food in front of their mouths and they salivate. Now Pavlov has taught them or conditioned them to salivate whenever they hear the bell, hear the tuning fork. It has gone from unconditioned to a conditioned response. So from the behaviorist perspective, if we're talking about behavior, they might say something like, well, the dog learned to salivate in response to the tone because the tone had been paired with the meat. The dog learned to salivate. Whereas a cognitive perspective, although we're saying something very similar, but albeit a little bit different, is the dog actually salivated in response to the tone since the tone became mentally connected with the meat. Obviously, either way, we're saying there is some kind of connection between the meat and the tuning fork, and now the dog is salivating. And they're both kind of saying the same thing, but they're explaining it with a little bit of a different vocabulary. So something to keep in mind, looking at the same phenomena, but with two different perspectives. So the terminology, again, the important terminology for this course, the unconditioned stimulus, this is the food. The unconditioned response is the dog salivating. If you put food in front of your dog, go home and do it right now. Or if you're at home and you have a dog, try it. Your dog will probably not only start salivating, but they may also start begging as well. All kinds of behaviors are elicited naturally. When you use the tuning fork in between, you combine the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. This eventually becomes conditioned. It goes from unconditioned to conditioned. Now the dog is salivating, not at the sound, not at the side of the food, but at the sound of the tuning fork. The tuning fork is anticipation for potential food. So here it is, laid out. You ring the bell, nothing happens. When Pavlov first walks in there, he rings the bell. The dogs leads to no predictable response. The dogs might even look at him funny, like, what the heck are you doing? Eventually, Pavlov shows them the food. Now the dogs are salivating. They're beginning the digestion process. The unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned response in the dog. Now, if Pavlov pairs these two together enough times, rings the bell, food, rings the bell, food, rings the bell, the dog now associates or has learned or has been conditioned that the bell means there is food coming. The dog will begin to salivate on its own without having food present. So it is now, the former neutral stimulus is now the conditioned stimulus. Some other things to keep in mind, though, if Pavlov stops ringing the bell and presenting the food together, or just stops ringing the bell, stops presenting the food with the bell, the behavior of salivating at the sound of the bell may eventually go extinct. And we don't mean extinct like the dodo, like it's gone forever, but it no longer elicits the response of salivation. But there is a possibility of spontaneous recovery. Maybe a day passes, some time passes, and Pavlov walks in with the bell and rings it, or the tuning fork and rings it, and now the animal, the dog, starts salivating again. But obviously, if Pavlov doesn't bring food, then that response is going to become extinct, and over time will eventually become extinct. But there's a possibility of spontaneous recovery. So here is the acquisition phase. Here's a graphical representation. The researcher starts pairing it alone. We see the behavior and salivation decreasing. Here's some time passing. And then there's a spontaneous recovery after trials are resumed. Okay, so I want to check your comprehension before we move on. A couple more slides and then we're going to wrap up here. So a young boy goes to the zoo for the first time with his father and his sister. While he is looking at a bird display, his sister sneaks up on him and startles him. He becomes very frightened. And now when he sees birds outside or on TV, he cries. The unconditional response is A, is it fear? B, is it birds? C, is it being startled by a sister? Or D, going to the zoo? So what I would like for you to do is go ahead and pause the video and check your comprehension, write your answer down, and come back. So first of all, okay, welcome back. The unconditional response is the response that is unlearned, meaning there's no association built yet. This is something, an instinctive response that happens naturally. So, what example? I think C would be the most appropriate for this, because being startled by a sister, nobody had to teach this boy that when somebody comes up behind you and startles you, you jump and get scared. That's a natural instinctive response. It is unconditioned. If I ask for the conditional response, it might be frightened when he sees birds or TV. That is conditioned. He's been taught that. But the unconditional response is usually the stimulus response. The instinctive response. So, some other important terminology for classical conditioning is generalization. It's the tendency for the conditional response to be evoked by other stimuli that is similar. And again, this is exactly why Pavlov used a tuning fork. He didn't want to use something else that the organism the dog might confuse it with. He wanted it to be a very specific sound. So, you think about, if you live at home still, or you remember living at home with your parents, and if your mom or dad ever called you down for dinner, if mom calls you down for dinner, that evokes a response of, you've been conditioned when mom yells, it's time to go downstairs. But it's not as if hey, if dad yells, you're just going to sit there and ignore it. You can generalize what you've learned from when mom yells to also when dad yells to bring you downstairs. Or, your guardian or whoever, maybe grandma, grandpa, brother, sister, whomever. You can apply this elsewhere. It wouldn't make a lot of sense if you just totally ignored, mom or dad and listen to the other when they're doing the same sort of stimuli, if that makes sense. Again, there's discrimination as well, being able to discriminate between stimuli that causes the response and discriminate and the stimuli that doesn't. The dogs could discriminate between when Pavlov rings the tuning fork, it's time for food. But if Pavlov just walks in and taps his foot on the ground 3 times, that does not indicate food, if that makes sense. There is higher order conditioning as well. There's also the possibility that maybe Pavlov also conditioned the dogs to be conditioned to salivate at other stimuli besides the tuning fork. When Pavlov walks in every day, he might also turn on a light. And so when the dogs see the light, they also associate that with the incoming tuning fork, and then they start salivating. So there is sort of there is a hierarchy of conditioning going on here. It's usually not just a simple X to Y. There might also be a Z involved as well. Okay, so kind of already talked about that. Classical conditioning, you've experienced it before. If you've ever experienced taste aversion, if you've ever eaten a food and gotten sick, and then, after that incident, you no longer like that food, that's an example of classical conditioning, specifically with taste aversion. There is an adaptive function to this, that if we eat something that causes us to be sick, we are kind of motivated in the future not to eat that food anymore, because it's kind of, our body is telling us, hey, this is bad for us. It might be poisonous, it might be rotten, it might be something, but it's signaling you are being conditioned very quickly to avoid foods like that. There's a reason why if we smell certain foods, we naturally become nauseous. You don't walk by a pile of garbage, of steaming garbage, before the garbage man comes by and all of a sudden, get a big whiff of that and get excited, and start salivating. You'd probably do the opposite. You might retch. You might, oh my gosh, this smells bad. It smells like it would hurt me. So anyways, taste aversion is pretty interesting that sometimes it only takes one time. You know, if you have one bad experience, say drinking too much, and you're old enough to drink and you go out with your friends and maybe you drink too much and now you come home and you're praying to the porcelain gods and you may say to yourself, hey, I'm never doing that again. You know, I'm going to hold back. I'm going to be more responsible, which you should. It only, you know, or you may say to yourself, I'm never, you know, you do that because you get sick because of a certain alcohol. And then you tell yourself, I'm going to avoid you know, Fireball for the rest of my life, or I'm going to avoid, you know, Jameson or whatever you know, made you sick. It only takes one bad experience in terms of to build taste aversion. Let's see. And again, there's a reason behind this. It's an evolutionary purpose. It helps us survive by avoiding things that might do us harm, eating and consuming things that do us harm. So truth or fiction, a single nauseating meal can give rise to taste aversion that lasts for years. What do you think? True or false? Pause the video. Welcome back. It is in fact true. I remember in 7th grade, I ate ramen noodles. I ate like a ton of ramen noodles over one weekend with a friend of mine, like staying the night, you know, having fun over in junior high. And I remember I got sick because I ate too many ramen noodles. And to this day, I can eat ramen. I can go to somewhere nice like Goro and eat ramen. But to this day, I do not eat cheap like quarter ramen noodles that you warm up in the microwave if I can avoid it. It's something about it, the salt, the smell, it just makes me feel kind of nauseous even to this day. And that's over, you know, 12, almost 20 years ago. Classical conditioning, another example is the Little Albert experiment where these two researchers in the picture, you have John B. Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner. They conditioned Little Albert here to be afraid of white fluffy rats, or excuse me, they wanted to condition him to be afraid of a rat. By what they would do is they'd put a rat in the playpen with him, and every time that Little Albert would get close to the rat or start to play with it, they would come up from behind him when he couldn't see and startle Little Albert. They would bang things together to make loud noises. They would yell or startle him to the point where Little Albert began to associate the rat with being scared, and eventually he would see the rat and begin to cry. But here's the crazy thing is that Little Albert not only cried when he saw the rat, but he also cried when he saw other furry organisms like a puppy or a cat, or sometimes if you know, the researcher wore a fur coat of the same color of the rat, Little Albert would freak out. He generalized those fears from one organism to another. And this shows that humans, we are sort of biologically prepared to develop certain fears, to develop phobias. They not only to develop them, but they serve a purpose to keep us safe. I know phobias suck, and it's not fun to be afraid, but there is a evolutionary aspect that is sort of kind of keeping you alive, so to speak. It may not seem that way, but that's kind of what the forces are behind this. And so the same thing, you know, if you can teach somebody to be afraid in the case of Little Albert, you can also use things like counter conditioning, flooding, systematic desensitization to reverse the process. You can teach people to be unafraid. You can expose them to the things that they're afraid of, and eventually they kind of get used to it. Hey, I'm no longer afraid of this. And the sad story about Little Albert was he was an orphan who was adopted before they had a chance to do any of these things with him. So actually, Little Albert actually lived out the rest of his life afraid of white, fluffy rabbits. Unfortunately, this took place a long time ago in the 19-teens, I think, or maybe even a little bit after. But Little Albert actually, research went back and found out he died at a pretty young age. But again, he was not allowed to go through these procedures, unfortunately. Okay, truth or fiction? Psychologists help a young boy overcome his fear of rabbits by having him eat cookies while a rabbit was brought closer and closer. This is true. Sorry, I should have told you to pause the video, but this is true. This is a way to desensitize or counter-condition fear of rabbits. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to stop at classical conditioning. We're going to pick up at operant conditioning. I threw a lot at you. Let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick back up with Edward Thorndike and operant conditioning. All right, see you then.